Hello and welcome to Levy's Customs. Today we're looking at an Acer Helios 300, the PH315 model. Spec-wise, it comes with an Intel Core i7-8750H that has 6 cores and 12 threads, a NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1060 6GB model, 16GB of RAM, a 256GB NVMe SSD, and a 1TB regular hard drive. It also comes with a 15.6-inch screen that has a 1080p resolution, but it has a refresh rate of 144 Hz compared to the usual 60 Hz. The thing with a panel or screen that runs at 144 Hz means you can have more frames being displayed per second than you would like a 60 Hz monitor. If you can get your computer to get that high of performance, 144 frames, it is super smooth to play on, and it would be especially good for first-person shooters where, accuracy and everything counts. The keyboard is pretty comfortable, but I felt like the keys were a little bit too far apart. Whenever I was typing, my fingers kept on landing in between the keys, and then I would hit two buttons at once, and then I'd have to backspace and try it again. On all 3 runs of the typing tests that I did, I got about 36 words per minute each time, so an average of 36, whereas my usual average is about 40 to 45, so my typing wasn't very good on this keyboard. So this is the webcam footage. I have a softbox, which is a lot of light hitting me from this side, and just look how grainy that is. That is nuts. It looks so bad. Gotta cut corners, and that's where gaming laptops typically cut them. Color looks okay, but that just could be the screen I'm looking at. Despite the quality of the webcam not being that great, the built-in speakers on this laptop were not too bad, and they helped cancel out a lot of the background noise. The speakers are located on the bottom of the laptop, so underneath it, and they shoot downwards. So a lot of times things were a little bit muffled, weren't very clear, and if you are on a surface that's not smooth, like let's say carpet or a bed or something, it's gonna get pretty muffled. That and the volume isn't as loud as it should be, so a lot of times I was hearing the roar of the exhaust fans over the sound of the game, even with the volume cranked all the way up on the games. So as you can hear, it's pretty loud. There was more than one time where it was a little bit distracting when I was playing a game. You're in the zone, and all of a sudden your ears catch on to this whirring sound that's pretty loud. I'd highly recommend using a headset or headphones with this laptop while gaming. Now let's move on to the benchmarks. We're going to do everything at 1080p, which is the laptop's native resolution. One thing I will bring up, and that you will see in the videos, I don't know if it was just because the computer, the monitor on the laptop is 144 Hz, and that my capture card only records up to like 60 Hz, 60 frames a second. So some of the games, even without VSync or any type of frame capping, it would limit itself to 60 frames per second. all I had to do was just unplug the laptop from the capture card, and then it would work perfectly fine. So I ran all the benchmarks separate from the video recordings just to be able to get a more accurate reading of what the frame rates were. Far Cry on the high preset got 70.5 frames per second and a 1% low of 22.3 frames per second. Even though the average for this game was above 60 frames per second, there were a lot of random stutters, and the proof of that is seen in the low 1% frame rate. Grand Theft Auto 5 on high settings got an average of 71.5 frames per second and a 1% low of 42.4 frames per second. GTA ran pretty smooth and without any issues. Killing Floor 2 on the high preset got us an average of 125.3 frames per second and a 1% low of 44.5 frames per second. This game also ran very well. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds on the high preset got an average of 79.4 frames per second and a 1% low of 21.5 frames per second. For the most part, PUBG ran fine, but there were several times where the frame rate would drop down into the 40s or even 30s. Red Dead Redemption 2 on the first level of the balance preset got us an average of 44.3 frames per second and a 1% low of 26.3 frames per second. I was hoping for a little better performance, but the game is pretty new and it's very demanding. Resident Evil 3, with a mixture of medium and high settings, got us an average of 101.7 frames per second and a 1% low of 50.6 frames per second. Resident Evil ran well, with only a few occasional drops in frame rate. Rainbow Six Siege on the very high preset got an average of 109.8 frames per second and a 1% low of 64.6 frames per second. Siege ran wonderfully even with high settings. Fortnite on the high preset got an average of 102.8 frames per second and a 1% low of 34.2 frames per second. Gameplay was smooth for the most part, but there were frequent dips below 50 frames per second. Now, I forgot what settings I set for Metro Exodus, but it was either low or medium, and it got us an average of 94.9 frames per second and a 1% low of 40.9 frames per second. Not bad performance, but there were some sharp frame drops. Overwatch on the high preset got an average of 156.3 frames per second and a 1% low of 59.5 frames per second. Another game that ran very smoothly. Modern Warfare Warzone on high settings got us an average of 83 frames per second and a 1% low of 19.4 frames per second. Even though the average frame rate was very good, the very low 1% value showed how badly the frames dip, and it happened pretty often. Shadow of the Tomb Raider on high got an average of 63.5 frames per second and a 1% low of 29.5 frames per second. The game ran well, but had some frame dips. Cinebench R20 got an average score of 1995, so that's not bad. This is the first time we're testing Puget Bench's Premiere Pro benchmark, and we got an overall score of 393, an export score of 40.2, a live playback score of 38.4, and a GPU score of 13.9. One thing that I noticed pretty quickly was how hot the keyboard got while I was playing games. There were times that I had to stop playing and just kind of shake my hands and let them cool off because it was getting very uncomfortable, sometimes even painful, to keep my fingers on the keys. So then I looked at MSI Afterburner's temperature information while I was playing some games, and I noticed that the CPU was reaching 96, 97 and kind of staying in that range. And then the GPU, of course, was a little bit cooler, 75 to 80 degrees. So I wanted to take a look and see, what the deal was. But before I even got to opening it up, I looked at the intake ventilation, which was pretty poor. Not a lot of air is able to get into the laptop. And then the exhaust isn't very big either. So I'm wondering if, maybe that's what's contributing to it. I went ahead and opened it up, and as you can see, there are 3 heat pipes total. 2 heat pipes are shared by the CPU and the GPU, and then the GPU gets its own separate heat pipe as well. Now, I'm not an expert on this, like thermal design and stuff, but I feel like the CPU is having a hard time dissipating heat because it's also sharing its heat pipes with the GPU. Like, it doesn't have its own branch to go off and, dissipate somewhere else. A lot of gaming laptops tend to have, GPU and CPU, and then on both sides there are fans with heat sinks. That way heat is able to go in 2 directions instead of having to go one direction. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but this is just what seems, observation-wise. I also noticed there was a disparity between the average a game was getting, the average frame rates, and the 1% low. Sometimes it was more than double, and this may be because it was getting so hot. When a GPU or a CPU gets too hot, there's a kind of a threshold, and when it hits that threshold, the computer lowers the performance of that component so that it's generating less heat, meaning, the heat cooling system can compensate and, go underneath that threshold again. So that may be why there's some drops. But overall, I was very happy about the performance from this laptop. The one thing to consider, though, is the 144 Hz monitor. If you're really wanting to unleash the full potential of the monitor, you may have to dial the settings back on a lot of these games so that they can hit, upwards of 144 frames. And again, there's also the heat issue. When I was playing games, my hands were very uncomfortable. It made me not want to play anymore, but I forced myself because we got to get those benchmarks. I mean, it was even getting uncomfortable 15-20 minutes into playing games. It was not good. I recommend using a separate keyboard, but then that also kind of makes the laptop less portable. So kind of have to choose. Heat like this, especially if it's not being ventilated very well, can shorten the lifespan of components like your motherboard or graphics card. And with laptops, it's not like a desktop. You can't just pull out the graphics card, pop in a new one, hey, it's fixed. Most things are soldered onto the board and you can't replace it. So you'd have to send it in and spend a lot of money on shipping and getting it fixed and to have it come back, and it might happen again. So that is another concern. Acer gaming laptops are pretty cheap for what you get, though. It can punch higher than its price range, but you can definitely tell where they cut corners, and it seems like build quality is one of them. If all these negatives are acceptable to you, then this is a pretty great little gaming laptop. I was very pleased with the performance. Now, I don't know if they make these anymore. Like, the CPU is a couple generations behind, the graphics card is a generation behind at the time of recording this. But I found it on Amazon. They're still selling some for about $13.50. I'll try to put a link in the description if I remember. But it is something you can still buy brand new. So if you are interested in it, I would definitely check it out. And if you can find it used, that's even better value. Anyways, that's my take on the Acer Helios 300 PH315. I hope you guys got some valuable information out of it, and maybe this will help you decide what gaming laptop to get. But I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks.